Hello, everyone. We are live with another episode of Level Up Law, where every Tuesday at noon, South Carolina Legal Services levels up your legal knowledge about an area of law that we practice in. Today, we will be wrapping up Native American Heritage Month, and this will be more of an informational presentation than it is an area of law that we practice in, but we thought it was appropriate to let our viewers and our audience know some of the things that are going on in the world of Native American heritage, Native American laws, regulations, programs, and so forth, just to wrap up the month and let you know kind of what's going on, how things work in South Carolina, and just some information and sort of answers to frequently asked questions that you may have. So we'll get started in just a moment, but first I do want to make sure that you know that we're not providing any legal advice. We certainly don't practice tribal law, but we do represent Native Americans in our regular practice in other areas, so that's important to know. If you do need the help of a lawyer, you can always call our intake line here at South Carolina Legal Services, or you can apply online, and all the information about how to do that will be provided at the end of today's presentation. And just remember, all of our episodes are recorded, and they're posted to the Level Up Law playlist on our YouTube channel, so you can always access it there. So we do recommend that you check it out, and be sure to check out all of our social media, like and subscribe to get all the up-to-date information that we provide here on Level Up Law, and all the other resources that we have, news and events, outreach clinics, workshops that might be going on around the state. All of those websites and social media handles can be also found on the last slide of this presentation, but also accessible from our website at www.sclegal.org. So let's get started and wrap up Native American Heritage Month 2021. We'll be looking at some recent things that have happened just this month first, and then we'll talk about some general questions. So first, I wanted to talk about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, this was announced over 14 years ago. It was 14 years, I think, in September of this year. And it is a very comprehensive instrument, and we will provide a link to that down below. But it establishes just a framework for Indigenous peoples all across the globe. So very important document that really got the ball rolling, not just for the United States, which was a late adopter, but all over the globe. But here's some highlights. There are articles that address how to protect and promote Indigenous cultures. 15 of the 46 articles call for participation in all decisions that affect the lives of Indigenous peoples, confirming their rights to just and fair redress when deprived of their means of subsistence and development, and also just calling on states to provide mechanisms and measures to combat and eliminate discrimination against Indigenous peoples and so forth. So that's really a great place to begin today's discussion. More recently, here in South Carolina, HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge traveled here to visit the Catawba Nation. And during that visit, she stressed the government's commitment to dedicating more resources to the housing needs of the Catawba Nation and other tribes, and not just here in South Carolina, but across the United States. This was one of 13 visits by administration officials to tribes in the United States in 2021. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, the White House had a Tribal Nations Summit, and you can see the link to the progress report of that summit because it was just the beginning. There had not been a summit since 2016, so this was definitely long overdue. You can check the progress report for some of the great details of what is going on when it comes to the government's work with Native Americans. In conjunction with the summit, the president issued this executive order for improving public safety for Native Americans. And we'll link also to that executive order where it is published for you. Essentially, let's first talk about what is an executive order. You know, an executive order is a rule or an order that is issued by the president. And it's directed or issued to an executive branch of our federal government. For example, the Department of the Interior, which deals with Native Americans. And it has the force of law, but it's not really a law. It's not a law because that has to be done by Congress. The president cannot legislate, but he can, or she can, issue an executive order to a branch of government to you know, do something in particular or focus on something in particular or take care of their responsibilities in a certain way. So sometimes after an executive order is issued, it will be followed by legislation by Congress, but it is not a law, though it has the force of law. In this particular executive order, you can see here on your screen that the president announced the improving public safety and criminal justice for Native Americans and addressing the crisis of missing or murdered indigenous peoples. And although executive order is a somewhat lengthy document, not too bad, but somewhat lengthy document, it generally lays out the administration's policy on a particular matter and gives a little bit of the history of what's been going on in that arena. And when it comes to Native Americans, one of the focuses of this executive order is sexual violence and physical violence towards Native Americans, and the need to do more to improve what's going on with Native Americans when it comes to that. Now, earlier this year, the Secretary of the Interior and the Attorney General announced a joint commission, and that is reviewed here in the executive order that was issued on November 15th this year. And it was established actually pursuant to the Not Invisible Act, which has was, I think, passed in 2019. Anyway, that act includes, or the Joint Commission will include representatives of tribal, state, and local law enforcement. And what they will do is work to address the persistent violence that's endured by Native American families and communities across the country. And actually, the Department of the Interior has established a special unit to focus resources on active and unsolved missing persons cases. So there's a lot going on with this executive order. I think the crux of the matter is, though, that our government is starting to focus on problems and issues that Native Americans, tribal nations have been seeking, lobbying the government to deal with. So that's going to be, I think, a really helpful executive order to produce some results that the government, the federal government, is really looking for when it comes to Native Americans. Also, earlier this month, even earlier than the executive order, HUD announced about $73.9 million to deliver equitable COVID-19 relief to tribal communities. And that's really, really important to have a way to really focus on the critical needs that tribes have and to help them prepare for, and respond to COVID-19. You see a quote here from HUD Deputy Secretary Adrian Todman, and we've also provided a link to a press release that gives even more information about these new block grants. So it's great to know that the government is addressing the critical needs of tribes and the housing needs that they have. So I wanted to mention, there's a number of organizations all over the country, and but the Native American Rights Fund is one that has a website, and in their website they have a lot of information about the news, not only in general when it comes to Native Americans, Alaska Natives, and Hawaii Natives, but also what's going on with the law, whether it be reported cases, new laws, and that sort of thing. So it's a great resource, and today we're going to use some information that they have on their website just to inform you a little bit about some things you might be wanting to know, some terminology and that sort of thing. And they provide some great answers to those questions that so many of us tend to have from time to time when it comes to Native Americans. And so first, who is a Native American? And as a general principle, an Indian is a person who is of some degree Indian blood and is recognized as an Indian by a tribe, village, or just the United States in general. So any of those can recognize someone as a Native American. So, because there's not really any exact rule on how you establish that identity. Different tribes have different criteria for establishing that. The Bureau of the Census, interestingly, the Census Bureau, if you just put on your census information that you are Native American, then they recognize you as that. There's not any kind of proof or anything when it comes to the Census Bureau that you have to provide. And 2.9 million, according to the most recent census, 2.9 million people in the United States are Native Americans, and that includes Native Alaskans and Native Hawaiians. So why are Indians sometimes referred to as Native Americans? Well, it's appropriate, according to NARF, to use the terms American Indians and Alaska Natives when referring to those people. It denotes a cultural distinction between those who were on the continental United States and then natives of Alaska. And the term Native Americans began to be used back in the 60s. but it has expanded to include all Native people, even American Samoans. Now, what is an Indian tribe? Well, it was originally a body of people who were bound together by certain things. But in the eyes of the U.S. government, a body of people who are connected by blood ties, socially, politically, and religiously, have to be officially recognized in order to be considered a tribe. And so what does federally recognized mean? Well, those are just tribes who are maintaining a relationship, a legal relationship to the U.S. government through treaties, acts of Congress, executive orders, and so forth. So once your tribe is recognized, you have a legal relationship with the United States. It's a political thing. So there are currently over 550 federally recognized tribes in the United States. And then that includes some village groups in Alaska, some 200 actually village groups in Alaska. And it's a really lengthy process, an arduous process to get federal recognition. So hundreds are still working on that right now. It is not an easy process. So tribal sovereignty, we hear that a lot. What does that mean, and why is that important? Well, it's the right of a tribe to govern themselves, to govern their lands and their people. And it also, tribal sovereignty means that you have a government of your own as a tribe, and that includes a relationship to the United States government. You're an independent nation, have your own government, adjudicate your own laws, establish what it takes to be a member, levy taxes, and the federal government, of course, then has a trust responsibility to protect the tribal lands, assets, resources, and whatever treaty rights are in existence. We hear the term reservation a lot. What is a reservation? Well, in the United States, there's two kinds of reserved lands that we hear about, military and Indian. An Indian reservation is a land base that a tribe reserved for itself when it relinquished other lands originally. And more recently, a reservation can actually be created through our Congress, executive orders, and also just administrative acts. So some reservations do include non-Indian residents and landowners, not just Native Americans. So are Indians U.S. citizens? Yes. They weren't until 1924 officially, but before that, before 1924, it was only members of federally recognized tribes and naturalized individuals who had the rights of United States citizens. Hard to believe, but it's true. But now all Native Americans born within the territorial limits of the United States are by law citizens. So been able to vote since 1924. Some states, until recently, actually prohibited voting in local elections. For example, New Mexico did not extend the vote to Native Americans until 1962. That wasn't all that long ago, 60 years, I guess. Most Native people also are members of their respective sovereign tribes, as well as being a U.S. citizen. Are they exempt from military service? No. Native Americans do have the same obligation of military service to the United States because they're citizens, even though they have tribal sovereignty. And do Indians pay taxes? All Indians are subject to federal income taxes. And also, the tribal governments can also levy their own taxes. Some of them do and some of them don't. For example, they may or may not pay sales tax on goods and services that are purchased on the reservation. But if they're off the reservation and conducting business, state and local taxes do apply. So that goes with the individual. And on reservation or trust lands, state income taxes are not paid. Okay, special rights and benefits. You know, it seems like there's a popular belief that Indians do not receive payments from the federal government, that they do receive payments from the federal government just because they have Indian blood. That's actually not the case. But there are some sources of funds that are paid to a person of Indian descent. For example, mineral rights from property that they own and maybe lease to the federal government, or particular benefits from the government that have to do with treaty obligations. So they do have some right to payment, but it's not just simply because they have that Native American blood. So let's talk about that state and federal recognition, because we do also have law here in the state of South Carolina that provides a process for becoming recognized by the state. So let's say, what does recognized actually mean? Well, it's to be formally acknowledged, obviously by a state or the federal government, as an actual government, a Native American tribe. So a citizen of a tribal nation or member of a tribe is actually not a racial identity, but a political status. So being formally recognized means you are recognized as a sovereign government of your own. Now here's some other terms that do come up here in South Carolina, which also has a very arduous process for getting approved. And you can be recognized as a tribe, a group, or actually a special interest organization. So here you see what those are defined as. Tribe, I think we all kind of know what that tends to be. Group, a little bit different in that a group is not all related to one another by blood, and some other things. And then there are special interest groups who promote Native American culture as well as social and economic issues, and those can be recognized as well. Why would you want recognition? Well, here's some of the reasons that you can think of and see why a tribe would want that recognition. Mainly, they want that political sovereignty so that they could actually combat claims by others to be a Native American or of some sort of Native American heritage when they really aren't, or when there's really no, little or no evidence of that. And, you know, in that vein, we think of the phrase that was coined as the grandmother complex. I think there was a Native American who said, you know, some people say, oh, my grandmother was a Native American, therefore I am, but they don't really have any evidence. So that's been an interesting development. But recognition as a Native American can, as a tribe, can help with your land ownership, jurisdiction over the members of your tribe, access to health care benefits, and a lot of other kinds of funding and resources that are available, just like the COVID-19 funding that we just mentioned earlier, that's focused on providing assistance to Native Americans regarding COVID-19 and the response for that. the main thing too with federal recognition is there are so many more benefits and influence when it comes to federal legislation. There are programs and funding that can be accessed from the federal government if you are recognized in that way. So in South Carolina, we have, of course, particular division of the Minority Affairs Department of South Carolina. There is a Native American division in our South Carolina Office for Minority Affairs. And in that body of law, there are criteria for recognition as a tribe, a group, or a special interest organization. So we can look at those just very briefly. So here are the 11 requirements to be recognized as a Native American Indian tribe in South Carolina. Now, as you can see from the title, you have to meet requirements 1 through 9. You don't have to meet requirements 10 and 11. They're optional, but I would think that you would probably want to cover that as well. I think the main thing is to think about here is you have to have had a presence in the state for 100 years. That's the big one here. And to exist to meet the spiritual, social, economic, or cultural needs for Native American Indian culture and history. And so, in addition, you have to provide documentation. And that's really important, as we'll talk about in just a moment. But you have to have a minimum of 100 living descendants who are 18 or older and whose lineage can be documented and appear on the tribal roll. So there's a lot of hoops to jump through to get that recognition. But here's the list of what you have to do. And again, just like with the federal process, this is a very tedious and complicated and lengthy process to go through. It's good to know about. Then you have the Native American Indian group. Okay. And I might mention here that this area of law in South Carolina, the statute was amended just recently in 2018, so it was changed kind of in a broad sense. But anyway, the group has to be, again, here in South Carolina, indigenous to South Carolina. So it can't be a group that has moved their overall residents from another state. But a minimum of 3 years here. So this is much different than the 100 years to be recognized as a tribe. And some of the other similar requirements to be recognized as a tribe. You have to exist to meet the needs of Native American Indian people, spiritual, social, economic, and cultural needs. And in doing that, you have to be providing educational programs and activities that do preserve, document, and promote that Native American Indian culture and history. And then finally, as with all the others, the claims must be supported by official records that are listed here. And then there is the optional requirement here as well, number 6, which is similar to for tribes. Those are letters, statements, and documents that can document what you are saying is your reasoning for being recognized as a group. And then finally, the special interest organization recognition, and that has 4 requirements and has to have been formed and operating for at least 2 years before it can apply for recognition and has to represent the interests of Native American Indian people residing here in South Carolina. And it does need to be a private, nonprofit corporation organized under our law here in South Carolina. And you must have letters, statements, and documents from tribes attesting to the work of your organization and how it promotes that culture, Native American culture, and how it addresses all those socio-economic issues. And then again, requirement that is optional here on special interest organizations, and that is those supporting letters, statements, and documents from state and federal authorities that document a history of tribal-related business and activities that specifically address Native American Indian culture, preservation, and affairs. And one thing I thought it was important to mention is we talk about how arduous and tedious the process is for getting that recognition. The documents that are provided have to be verified as being authentic. If it's copies of official records and other documents, it must include a way for the State Recognition Committee to determine that it is in fact authentic. So, and there's ways to do that, notarized affidavits and that sort of thing. So you have to, the recognition committee that reviews all these has to be able to verify everything that you're providing. And for some tribes, the records are kept very close at hand. They're sometimes, under lock and key. And so it does state that members of the committee can conduct a review of those so that they can remain under lock and key, but must be able to be viewed by the committee if they are being relied on in any way to get recognition for any of these groups. Well, that concludes everything that we have to go over today to wrap up National Native American Heritage Month for 2021. A lot going on with the government when it comes to Native Americans and trying to really address the needs that they have as a special population of sorts in our country. And so we'll link down below the interim report from that recent summit at the White House, the executive order, the press release on the COVID-19 assistance, and some of the other important things that have happened in the Native American world when it comes to the government this month. It's always important that we have awareness months, I think, and this month certainly is no exception there, because it really does give us an opportunity to focus on a particular area of law, a particular segment of our population that has special laws that might apply to them. And we hope that you have found not only today's presentation helpful, but all of the other information that we have posted on our website and our social media throughout the month. So definitely look down below in the description for those links, because there's so much great information. I'll be including a link to a recent law review article from 2021 in the American Indian Law Review, a really great article that talks about not only the history, but the more recent legal happenings when it comes to Native Americans. So definitely be sure to check that out. We thank you for joining us. That concludes today's presentation. And I want to reiterate that you should definitely, if you found this helpful, be sure and share it with others whom it may be either helpful to or just they may have an interest in. I think it's very good information from a lot of different sources, but it gives you a really good eye on what's currently happening within the government to help our Native Americans. And I do ask that you, if you found this on our YouTube channel, definitely hit that red subscribe button so that you can see anytime we have a new episode of Level Up Law or some other video or material gets posted to our YouTube channel. You can go and check it out and see if it's going to be helpful to you. Share it with others who it might be helpful to. We do a new episode every Tuesday at noon, and so we ask that you definitely tune in every Tuesday at noon. You can find the throughout the week, usually beginning on Thursday or Friday, you can find the registration link if you want to register for the live episode. But you can also, again, find this episode and many others on our Level Up Law playlist on our YouTube channel at SC Legal Services on YouTube. So thanks for joining us today on Level Up Law, and be sure and tune in next week for another episode of Level Up Law on Tuesday at noon. Thanks for joining us, everyone. That concludes today's webinar.